Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tombstone. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1881, and Tombstone stood as a restless city balanced between prosperity and decay. The silver mines beneath its dusty streets had turned men into millionaires, and its saloons turned nights into chaos. But beyond the noise, the city carried an unease, a sense that everything glittering under its hard desert sun came at a cost. It was in this uneasy air that Clara and Isabel Ward arrived. No record of their stagecoach entry exists, though one account in a freight ledger marks 2 women passengers disembarked near Allen Street. They registered no family, no companions, no employer. What they brought with them were crates, 12 of them, marked only with the initials CWIW inside faded borders. Locals would later recall that the sisters carried themselves with the composure of school teachers, but the poise of women who knew how to listen rather than speak. They rented a small storefront close to 3rd and Fremont, not far from the edge of the growing fairground where preparations for the Harvest Festival were beginning. The fair was meant to bring together miners, ranchers, and merchants after a long season of drought, an attempt to make Tombstone seem civilized. From the beginning, however, the sisters' business was odd. The shop bore no name, only a wooden placard painted with a faded image of a wheat stalk and a crescent moon. Inside, they sold tonics, bitters, small charms, and jars of amber liquid said to ease the lungs or steady the mind. Their customers were mostly women, miners' wives, cooks, and seamstresses, drawn less by what was sounds old, and more by the strange calm that hung inside the room. One surviving letter from a local tailor, Mrs. Ada Crane, describes them this way. The elder Clara had a manner most deliberate, her voice like one in church prayer. Isabel was the brighter younger one, though her eyes lingered longer than polite. No one knew where they came from. Some whispered California, others hinted New Orleans. The local physician, Dr. Merritt, claimed they had a letter of reference from a dispensary, but could not recall its name. By late August, as Tombstone's gunfight at the OK Corral was still weeks away, the Ward sisters announced they would sponsor a booth at the first Harvest Fair. Their stall was said to sell flavored tonics and herbal remedies. It seemed harmless enough until the fair opened and the disappearances began. The first missing person was a young mule driver named Elias Porter, last seen carrying supplies near the fairground. 2 days later, a vendor's assistant vanished after closing time. Locals muttered about late-night gatherings, bottles moving under moonlight. Morning came heavy and silent after the second night of the Harvest Fair. The fairgrounds, once filled with laughter and the clatter of wagons, felt hollow. The wind carried a strange odor, part smoke, part sweet herbs, from the row where the Ward sisters kept their stall. A few vendors complained of headaches and dizziness, though none thought much of it at the time. The town marshal, Virgil Earp, was still preoccupied with enforcing Tombstone's no-weapons ordinance in anticipation of trouble brewing between the cowboys and the Earps faction. That tension would later culminate in the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, but at this moment it merely served to distract the law from quieter wrongs. By late afternoon, Clara Ward was seen scrubbing the counter of her stall with a cloth dipped in a dark mixture that smelled faintly of iron. Isabel, meanwhile, arranged bottles in neat lines, their labels handwritten in looping script. Restorative tonic, spirit of calm, essence of mirth. Most were sealed with black wax. Only 1 or 2 were offered for sale at a time. In the surviving town records, there is a curious note written by a junior clerk named Samuel Dyer, who had been assigned to inspect merchant permits. He wrote, "The Ward booth had all proper documentation but no receipts of purchase or trade. When I asked to see their supplier, Miss Clara stated, 'Our sources are of the soil, Mr. Dyer. No man's business but the earth's.'" Dyer's statement was never officially filed, but a carbon copy remained folded inside an envelope labeled "Unusual Vendors." As night fell, Several miners drinking at the Crystal Palace Saloon claimed they saw dim lights flickering inside the ward tent after closing hours. Some thought it was just the sisters working late. Others said it looked like lanterns being lowered into the ground. One witness, Tom Finley, who worked the IFE, Ayers Freight Line, gave a statement to a deputy years later. There was a humming, low and steady, like a woman singing without words. I swear on my life I saw something move beneath that tent floor. Thought it was a dog till I saw the earth shiver. No official search followed. By dawn, the ward stall was spotless, almost unnaturally so, and the fair resumed. The sisters greeted visitors with their usual poise, pouring small samples of herbal tonic for ladies and water for the curious. Nothing seemed amiss, yet something beneath the polite veneer unsettled people. Mrs. Crane, the same neighbor who had once admired their grace, wrote later in her journal, "Their eyes no longer met mine. They spoke softly, as if repeating words they could not change. It was as though something had emptied them of self." That night, Isabel Ward was seen walking alone toward the riverbed carrying a single lantern. She did not return until morning. Her dress was torn at the hem, her gloves soiled with clay. Clara, witnesses said, seemed relieved to see her. When the third disappearance occurred, a traveling salesman who had been renting a tent near the fairground, suspicion grew. But the sisters, calm and composed, hosted an afternoon tea the following day for the few women who still trusted them. They smiled, they poured, they served, and then, quietly, they began packing. In the following week, their rented storefront on Fremont Street stood empty. The windows were boarded, the furniture sold to a local merchant. No one saw them leave town, though an unconfirmed stage manifest lists 2 women boarding for Benson, a nearby settlement. Behind their abandoned stall, laborers found 3 small pits. Each in the weeks following the fair's closure, Tombstone returned to its usual rhythm of saloon disputes and mining quarrels. The Ward sisters had vanished as quietly as they arrived, and most townsfolk preferred not to dwell on them. Yet something lingered. People spoke of sudden illnesses, of a dull ache that spread among those who had tasted the sisters' tonics. A merchant named Henry Stillwater filed a statement in October 1881 claiming that 4 of his regular customers had taken ill with tremors and fever of no ordinary sort. Each had, by their own account, purchased a bottle from the Ward girls. Dr. Merritt, who examined one of the afflicted, noted an odd residue at the bottom of a small glass vial found in the woman's home. Dark as tar, heavy as mercury. He could not identify it. His note, preserved in the Cochise County Medical Ledger, reads simply, "Sample defied boiling, foul odor when burned, patient's pulse irregular, suspicion, contamination or poison unknown to my practice." Still, the city's attention lay elsewhere. The gunfire of the OK Corral erupted later that same month, overshadowing everything else. As the papers filled with names like Wyatt and Virgil Earp, the Wards faded from memory, dismissed as odd peddlers who'd left town. But deeper in the archives, an unsigned affidavit dated November 12, 1881, hints otherwise. Search made of booth site revealed flooring not of standard timber. Beneath, compact soil disturbed. Recovered fragments of textile, human hair, and 1 porcelain tooth. Who filed that report remains unknown. The handwriting does not match any known clerk. The document ends with a single phrase underlined twice. Case closed by discretion. A month later, heavy rain washed through the fairground and collapsed part of the soil near the riverbed. Miners scavenging for scrap metal found a wooden crate lodged in the mud, sealed with black wax. Inside were 2 glass bottles wrapped in oilcloth, each half filled with viscous liquid and containing what looked like locks of blonde hair. There was also a notebook, soaked but legible in parts, with entries written in alternating hands. One of the lines read, "The harvest is not of grain, but of will. Only the willing drink." The sheriff's office logged the find, but never released it to the public. The crate was reportedly sent to the territorial office in Tucson. No trace of it has been found since. By December, talk of the sisters had turned to whispers. Children dared each other to walk past the old storefront, claiming they heard faint knocking behind the boarded door. One boy, Samuel Beach, later told his mother that he saw a shape like a woman's hand pressed against the dusty window from the inside. That same winter, fire gutted two nearby buildings, including the corner of Fremont and 3rd, where the Wards had lived. Officials called it accidental, the result of a knocked-over lantern. But among the ashes, a blackened lockbox was discovered. Inside, several burnt letters addressed to C. Ward from an unlisted sender in Prescott. The letters began formally, but ended in agitation, warning her to cease the mixing and remember what happened in Gila. That last line, remember what happened in Gila, remains the only clue connecting the sisters to any earlier record. The Gila County Archives list a small-town disappearance in 1879. 3 women from a mining camp found unconscious, one later dead after taking a restorative elixir from a traveling apothecary. The case was never solved. So perhaps Tombstone's Fair was not the beginning. Perhaps it was the continuation of something already practiced, refined, and perfected elsewhere, hidden beneath the civility of fairs and festivals, waiting for new ground to take root. By early 1882, the story of the Ward sisters had already curdled into rumor. In saloons, they became cautionary figures, the healing women who took more than they gave. Yet in the town's official ledgers, their names were struck through in ink, a bureaucratic erasure. Only in a handful of private journals did their shadow remain. One such journal belonged to Deputy Marshal Elijah Boone, who had briefly assisted Virgil Earp during the aftermath of the OK Corral gunfight. Boone wrote rarely of the sisters, but the few surviving pages tell more than any newspaper. In his February 1882 entry, he describes visiting the abandoned fairgrounds while scouting for illegal camps. Grounds overgrown, boards warped, found remnant of booth frame, iron nails still slick with rust, air close, as if trapped beneath the soil. I struck the floor with the heel of my boot, hollow, beneath a space no larger than a coffin. Boone pried up 2 planks and found a narrow cavity lined with cloth and filled with broken glass. He described the odor as chemical and sweet, the same phrase used by Dr. Merritt months before. Beneath the shards lay what he believed to be a human tooth, though the enamel had a strange metallic sheen. Boone sealed the cavity and turned his notes into the county office, where they were logged under unsubstantiated materials. 2 weeks later, Boone resigned. He moved north toward Prescott and never returned to Tombstone. Meanwhile, newspapers in neighboring towns began printing odd reports, stray sightings of 2 women matching the Ward sisters' description. One article from the Prescott Courier, March 1882, mentions 2 refined women offering medicinal consultations at the rail junction. They left suddenly after a rail worker collapsed during a session. Another clipping from Bisbee notes, suspicious female peddlers selling cure-alls chased out by miners. No names, only whispers of familiarity. Back in Tombstone, a few who had known the sisters began to reconsider what they'd seen. Mrs. Crane, the neighbor whose journal has served as our faint lantern through this story, added one final entry before leaving town. They said they worked with herbs, but herbs do not make a man forget his own name. I believe they sought not healing, but silence. Her statement hints at something more deliberate. An experiment, perhaps, or ritual disguised as remedy. Yet no direct evidence survives. The bottles, the ledgers, the crate from the river, all lost in the turnover of authorities and the chaos of the fires that repeatedly consumed Tombstone's record rooms through the 1880s. Even so, traces of the case continued to resurface like fragments washed ashore. In 1893, a university professor from Tucson, Dr. Jonas Keene, published a paper on 19th-century folk pharmacology in frontier towns. He cited, without naming the town, 2 sisters operating a curative stand whose tonics produced amnesia, tremor, and suggestibility. Keene had accessed some of Merritt's old medical notes before they, too, were destroyed in a later flood. He concluded his paper with an unsettling sentence. The phenomenon of will-induced compliance through tincture remains unproven, yet the witnesses insist the eyes of those women were calm as sleep. By then, the Ward sisters were ghosts of rumor, their story tangled among the greater legends of Tombstone, the Earp brothers, the cowboys, the fleeting fortune of silver. But if you sift through the sediment of those famous tales, their faint fingerprints still appear, in missing pages, burned margins, and the unease that clings to quiet booths and closed tents long after the crowd is gone. By spring of 1882, Tombstone had begun to empty out. The great silver veins were waning, and with them the people who'd built the town's brief empire. But in the emptying streets, the story of the Ward sisters refused to die. It surfaced in the way men avoided the fairground after dusk, or how women crossed themselves when the wind carried the scent of herbs. The Tombstone epitaph, which had ignored the early reports, printed a small notice that March under local oddities. By the summer of 1882, the Harvest Fair grounds had reverted to a patch of pale earth and brittle weeds. The booth frames were long gone, scavenged for firewood, but people still spoke of a feeling there, an invisible heaviness that made the horses balk and children cry without knowing why. A prospector named Amos McCready kept a private journal that year, later found among his estate papers in Bisbee. One entry reads, "Camped near the old fair plot. Awoke to find my lantern lit, though I doused it. The ground under my bedroll was damp, though there had been no rain. Heard a woman's voice say, 'It's almost time again.' No one there." McCready left the site the next morning. 2 weeks later, he was found wandering near Charleston, confused and half-blind from exposure. His last recorded words to the doctor were, "They said it wasn't over." That same season, another curiosity stirred. A railway inspector, Mr. Harold Dutton, reported finding crates of glass jars hidden in a dry creek bed 12 miles north of Tombstone. He assumed they were discarded medical supplies. When he opened one, he discovered not tonics, but preserved flowers and strips of parchment written in feminine handwriting. The labels bore short sentences: "Patience before bloom," "Shared breath," and once again that same crescent-shaped symbol Rowe had drawn in his notes. Dutton, thinking little of it, sent the find to a collector in Tucson. Within months, the collector's home burned. No insurance report survives, but the timing mirrors the loss of several courthouse archives, fires that, according to contemporary reports, began without clear cause. Around this time, Reverend Monroe, the same priest who had buried the strange vials, fell ill. His successor, Father Mallory, later testified that Monroe suffered night sweats and muttered phrases in his sleep. Among them, "They're still at work in the SOI." Vesubile. He died quietly in his rectory bed, and his diary vanished before his belongings were catalogued. But perhaps the most unsettling fragment from that summer comes from the personal notebook of Lucy Fairweather, a teacher newly arrived from Missouri. Her notes were discovered decades later, when her descendants donated her effects to the county museum. In an undated page, she wrote, "2 women called at my schoolhouse today, asking after the fair. Both dressed in gray travel wear, faces calm, not unkind, but their eyes, color of dust before rain. They asked if the festival would return this year. I said no. The younger smiled and said, 'Oh, it will. We never miss the harvest.'" Fairweather's handwriting falters after that line. There are ink blots, as though the pen had been dropped. She never mentions them again, but her final journal entry, written a week later, describes the night she left Tombstone for good. "I dreamt of fields breathing, not wind, but breath." Within a year, The teacher's small cottage near Fremont collapsed in a flash fire, cause unknown. Even as the town's mines dwindled and people moved on, that single phrase, "We never miss the harvest," survived in local folklore. Older miners used it as a warning to new arrivals. Don't linger near the fairground after sundown, and never touch what the rain unearths. And so the ward's story, erased from documents and drowned by bigger legends, began its second life as something else entirely. No longer a case, but a caution, repeated quietly to children whenever the winds turned warm and the air carried that faint metallic sweetness once again. By 1883, Tombstone had become a town of ghosts in more ways than one. The silver boom had faltered, leaving behind abandoned shafts and men who spoke more to memory than to one another. Yet through the town's quiet decay, one rumor persisted, that the fair would return, as the sisters had promised. It began with a handbill, printed on yellowed paper and nailed to the door of the Crystal Palace Saloon. It read simply, "The harvest returns, one night only, offerings of light and soil." No date, no organizer's name, just a symbol. The turn of the century brought silence to Tombstone. By 1900, the population had dwindled to a fraction of what it was during the boom. Buildings sagged in the desert sun, their paint eaten away by dust and time. But the townsfolk who remained still avoided the southern edge of town, where the Harvest Fair once stood. One of the few who ventured there was Deputy Raymond Holt, a man with more curiosity than sense. In 1902, he was tasked with mapping the old properties for a proposed railway spur. Holt's field diary, later recovered from his niece's attic, contains the following note. "Old fairground, ground oddly soft in patches. Found glass embedded like veins of quartz. Some bottles whole, sealed with wax. Mark resembles wheat or moon. Opened one. Odor floral, then acrid. Dog vomited, soil hissed when spilled." He took a few of the fragments to the county office, but the clerk refused to handle them, remarking that the wax smelled alive. Holt stored the pieces in his shed. Within a week, he fell sick with trembling hands and failing sight. The official cause was heat stroke. Around that same time, a letter surfaced in the archives of the Arizona Territory Medical Society. It was unsigned, written in a woman's hand. "We are still among the fairs, though not as before. The tincture has changed. It listens now. When it breathes, we must answer." Historians debate whether the letter was authentic or a prank, but the phrasing matched that found in Clara Ward's partially recovered notebook. The harvest listens. In 1905, an itinerant photographer named Julian Marks visited Tombstone to document its decline. Among his surviving glass plates is one labeled Fairground South. The image shows a flat expanse, scattered with bottles glinting under the sun. But if you look closely, as later archivists did, two faint figures appear near the horizon, blurred, almost transparent. Marks never mentioned them in his notes, but his final letter home, dated that winter, reads, "The sisters are patient. They pose without being seen." He died the following spring, his lungs blackened not by coal or smoke, but by unknown corrosion. Through these decades, the crescent and wheat sigil appeared again and again, carved into windowsills, painted behind cupboards, inked in the margins of old ledgers, the pattern always the same, the proportions precise. Scholars today suspect it functioned as both trademark and invocation, a sign that whatever the Ward sisters had begun was still being practiced quietly across the territory. Yet by 1910, the legend softened. Children turned it into rhyme. "When harvest comes and lanterns gleam, don't drink what's sweet, don't fall asleep." The rhyme spread across schools from Bisbee to Tucson, carried by miners' families who barely remembered its origin. Only a few elderly residents would shake their heads and whisper that the rhyme was not a warning, it was an invitation. In that faded western light, Tombstone settled into history's margins. The gunfights remembered, the sisters forgotten. But every few decades, when drought burns the land and the festivals return to raise spirits, someone rediscovers the story. A relic, a photograph, a smell in the air. And the old symbol follows, drawn anew in dust or carved into a fence post, as if by a steady, unseen hand, continuing the work begun in 1881. By 1914, the name Ward had nearly disappeared from Tombstone's ledgers, but the stories persisted in fragments, the kind of tales told when the lamps were low and the wind scratched against the boards. Travelers passing through claimed that on certain moonless nights, the 1920s brought tourists to Tombstone. They came for the gunfight legends, the saloon reenactments, the promise of a living Wild West. But those who stayed longer began to hear a quieter story from the older locals, one they told only after dark. It wasn't about the Earps or the cowboys. It was about the women who came before the cameras, the ones who didn't leave a grave. In 1924, a traveling writer for the Arizona Republic, Helen Dorsey, spent several nights interviewing Tombstone's few remaining pioneers. Among her notes, now stored in a regional archive, she described visiting the site where the harvest fair had once stood. The land lies untouched, fenced by scrub mesquite. Old bottles protrude from the soil like ribs. The locals say the earth sighs when the heat drops. I felt a warmth under my boots, as though the ground still held a pulse. Her published article omitted these details. Instead, it focused on the legend of Wyatt Earp. But in the handwritten drafts, one page carries a faint smudge of brown across the margin, perhaps ink, perhaps something else. Scrawled in Dorsey's rushed hand are the words, "The sisters endure through what the soil remembers." Around that same year, an excavation crew repairing the foundation of the courthouse unearthed a small metal box. Inside were 2 coins, a lock of dark hair, and a folded note written on brittle parchment. The handwriting was feminine, the words faded but legible. Not buried, only resting. Harvest waits for hands to wake it. The discovery was logged briefly under miscellaneous finds and then misplaced. Only a copy of the inventory survives, the rest destroyed in yet another courthouse fire in 1928. That summer, a series of unexplained illnesses swept the southern edge of town. Workers complained of nausea and dizziness after digging drainage ditches through the old fairground. The local doctor attributed it to bad air from old mine shafts. Still, one nurse, Louise Carter, wrote in her medical diary, "The odor on their clothes was neither gas nor mold. It was sweet, metallic, and oddly cold, like flowers left too long in a sealed jar." She burned her uniform after the 3rd case. Meanwhile, collectors from Phoenix began buying up Tombstone relics, tokens, bullets, glass fragments, anything that might tie to the frontier's myth. One collector, George Hannity, purchased several medicine bottles unearthed by laborers. He displayed them in his study until, according to family testimony, a black film crept across the glass. The bottles were later destroyed, though Hannity's surviving letters mentioned the faint outline of a crescent scratched into one of the stoppas. By the decade's end, the legend of the Ward sisters had twisted into folklore. 2 ghostly healers wandering desert fairs, appearing whenever drought threatened, promising relief and leaving sickness. But the earliest written accounts, the ledgers and affidavits, were already vanishing into dust or flame. In 1931, an unnamed visitor from Tucson, possibly a university archivist, left a short note in Tombstone's guest registry. "The soil here is not done speaking. I heard laughter under the wind." The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unmistakably feminine. By 1934, the country was gripped by the Great Depression, and the few who still clung to Tombstone did so out of stubbornness rather than hope. Abandoned buildings sagged into the sand, the old fairground a patch of thistles and bones of glass that winked under the harsh sun. Yet even in that desolation, people spoke of visitors, 2 women in travel coats who arrived by rail and left before dawn. A diary from Sheriff Malcolm Raines, dated September of that year, contains a puzzling entry. Station master swears 2 women took the last train east, paid in coins blackened as if burned. They asked only for directions to the fairground. I checked myself later that evening. Footprints, 2 sets, led in, none out. Raines dismissed it as imagination. But the next day, the telegraph operator complained of nausea and the smell of sugar gone sour. That same week, the town's only general store received a parcel with no return address. Inside were 3 glass bottles, neatly corked, containing nothing but water. The note beneath them read, "Returned, as promised." The handwriting matched the century-old Ward ledger fragments now kept in Tucson's archive, slanted, elegant, and marked by a distinct cross-stroke through every T. In 1935, a WPA survey team cataloging Arizona's historical sites listed the old fairground among locations of minor cultural interest. One field assistant, Eleanor Voss, wrote in her report, "Soil unusually soft, with chemical iridescence when disturbed. We found 2 wooden stakes, blackened but upright. One bore the mark of a crescent joined with a stalk. Supervisor ordered site left untouched." When interviewed in the 1950s, long after she'd retired, Voss refused to elaborate. The only thing she said about that day was this: "The ground felt like skin." That same decade, local children revived the old rhyme, now set to a skipping tune, when hang. "For vest hums and bottles gleam, don't drink the dream, don't drink the dream." Parents laughed it off as nonsense, unaware that the same words had appeared, handwritten, inside a ledger from 1881, recovered years later in Tucson. A short-lived attempt at turning the site into a tourist attraction failed in 1939. The entrepreneur behind it, Mr. Lyle Becker, advertised "The Mystery of the Tombstone Sisters, a True Frontier Tale." He opened a small tent exhibit featuring glass replicas and old newspaper prints. On the second night, the structure caught fire. Witnesses claimed the flames burned blue. Becker moved away soon after and refused to speak of the incident. By the time the Second World War came, the fairground was nothing but memory. Soldiers passed through Tombstone on leave, taking pictures of the OK Corral and ignoring the fenced field to the south. Yet, in a few photographs from that era, overexposed and grainy, faint lights shimmer just beyond the frame, as if lanterns moved across the darkness. The negatives of those images are stored in the Library of Congress collection, catalogued under Unidentified Frontier Town, Arizona, circa 1941. No one has officially linked them to the Ward case, but locals who've seen them in print say the same thing. 2 small silhouettes stand beside the glow, calm, still, and waiting. And perhaps that is what Tombstone became by mid-century, a ghost of its own legend, the loud stories fading, the quiet one refusing to die. By the early 1950s, the world had moved on from the ghosts of Tombstone. Television brought back the gunfighters, the lawmen, and the saloons, but not the sisters. Their story was too quiet, too uncertain, and far too strange to fit into Western myth. Yet for the few who still lived near the old fairground, the past had not entirely gone still. A retired miner named Edgar Malloy kept a stack of audio reels, dictating his memories in the last years of his life. One reel, dated 1952, contains a trembling voice describing lights under the soil near the old fairground. Malloy recalls walking there at dusk after a storm and finding a wet patch where the rain hadn't reached. He said the ground seemed to breathe. There was a warmth to it, not heat like from the earth, but like something alive. I heard a hum, low. By the mid-1960s, Tombstone was no longer a town of survivors, but of tourists. The OK Corral had been rebuilt into a photo stop, the streets turned into a stage. Yet the southern edge, the old fairground, remained fenced and unmarked. Guides avoided it, maps ended before it, and when curious visitors asked why, they were told, "That land's not for show." In 1963, a group of documentary filmmakers from California arrived, planning a short historical feature on the legends of Arizona. Among them was Catherine Lowe, an assistant historian whose field journal survived the production. In one entry she writes, "Locals warned us not to film near the old harvest site, said our equipment wouldn't work. We laughed until the cameras jammed, all of them." The sound recorder played a hum, low and steady, even when unplugged. They packed their gear and left within 48 hours. Lowe later told colleagues she'd felt watched, not by something evil, just something expectant. Around that same period, construction crews began laying telephone lines near the fairground. One foreman, Luis Ortega, filed a report to the county works department. At a depth of about 3 feet, we struck old glass. Thought it was trash, but bottles all same size, same seal, crescent and wheat. Men refused to keep digging, claimed to hear breathing in the trench. The project was rerouted half a mile north. Meanwhile, interest in Western ghost stories surged across America. Magazines printed sensational pieces about haunted saloons, lost mines, and the witch sisters of Tombstone. None cited real sources, yet each reused the same 2 names, Clara and Isabel Ward. It was as if the rumor itself had a life of its own, updating every few decades, adapting to new fears. In 1967, the Arizona State Museum quietly received an anonymous parcel. Inside were 3 photographs, sepia-toned, clearly old, depicting 2 women standing behind a counter. The images matched daguerreotype style, stiff poses, serious faces, grain speckled with age. On the back of each print was handwritten text, "The Harvest, Tombstone, 1881. Experts verified the paper stock as authentic to the late 19th century, but could not identify the photographer. The museum stored them in a restricted file. One curator noted privately, "Their eyes seem alive, each print different, the faces slightly altered as if caught mid-breath." Years later, the negatives vanished during a catalog transfer. Only digital scans remain. That same year, the town council debated whether to repurpose the fairground into a parking lot. They ultimately abandoned the plan after the surveyor, Mr. Cole Benton, collapsed on site with sudden cardiac arrest. His last words, recorded by a paramedic, were, "Tell them it's still warm down there." After that, no one proposed development again. The fence remained. The weeds reclaimed the soil. And yet the stories grew louder in private circles. One elderly resident, Agnes Fairweather, descendant of the teacher Lucy, wrote a letter to a Tucson journalist. "My grandmother said they weren't ghosts at all. She said they learned to stay where the ground remembered them. The harvest was never theirs to end." The journalist never published the letter. He kept it in his notebook, found decades later in a resale shop. The paper smells faintly of iron and lavender. By the 1970s, the fairground had become an unofficial border between the living town and what locals called the Quiet Acres. Tour buses rolled down Allen Street daily, snapping photos of reenacted gunfights, while just beyond the last storefront lay a fenced patch of ground where nothing grew higher than a weed. It wasn't on any tour map, but people always asked about it, the way they ask about locked rooms in old houses. In 1972, a visiting journalist for Desert Chronicle, Michael Hawes, wrote one of the few serious modern articles on the legend. He approached the subject skeptically, tracing it to folklore and frontier hysteria, until something unexpected happened. In his notes, the 1980s brought a new wave of curiosity to Tombstone. The paranormal boom had begun. Books, late-night radio, television specials. Every haunted saloon and gunfighter grave drew visitors with cameras and cassette recorders. But none of the ghost hunters, no matter how daring, were permitted beyond the southern fence. Locals said the sheriff's office still held the keys, though no one could name who last carried them. In 1983, a Tucson researcher named Dr. Leonard Phelps applied for permission to survey the site using non-invasive equipment. The request was quietly denied, but Phelps came anyway. He brought an early electromagnetic field scanner and a reel-to-reel audio recorder. His notes, recovered after his death, describe 3 nights of testing. Field remains magnetically active, though devoid of power lines. Low hum, present in frequencies between 38 to 41 Hz, repeating pulse. Each reading peaks at same intervals, dusk and midnight. Second night, recorder captured overlapping female voices, phrase indistinct, possibly listen or with us. He left Tombstone the next morning. 6 months later, his assistant donated his equipment to the university. Both the tape and scanner were found warped and corroded, though sealed in a climate-controlled case. Around that same year, a drought hit Cochise County. The soil cracked, exposing fragments of old glass near the fence line. Tourists pocketed them as souvenirs until the town council banned removal of artifacts from historical property. Within weeks, several visitors reported nausea, dizziness, or temporary blackouts. The incidents never made the newspapers, but a handwritten log kept by the local clinic lists 8 patients under environmental exposure, fairground area. One witness, Officer Daniel Rhodes, recalled escorting 2 visitors off the property at sunset. They said they heard someone whisper it's red. I told them no one was there. When I looked back, one of them was kneeling, touching the dirt like it was warm. After that, Rhodes refused further patrols near the site. In 1986, a regional documentary series attempted a special episode titled Tombstone Beyond the Corral. The crew filmed interviews and historic sites. But when they reviewed the footage, the audio contained an unexplained underlayer, faint breathing that rose whenever the camera faced south. The sound engineer resigned mid-production, writing only, "Whatever it is, it's still drawing air." The episode never aired. Even so, the fascination persisted. By the decade's end, small articles and pamphlets circulated again. The Healers of the Desert, the Tombstone Sisters, Witches of the West. All retellings softened the truth, turning the wards into ghost story curiosities for tourists. The real records, the bottles, the affidavits, the burned letters, stayed hidden in archives or private collections, their existence known only to a few. But in 1989, on the centennial of Arizona's territorial fair, something strange happened. A hand-painted sign appeared on the fence at dawn, nailed to the old gate. The harvest returns, one night only. The paint was fresh. No footprints surrounded it. By midday, it was gone. Only the faint outline of the words remained on the wood, visible when the sun fell behind the hills. That winter, the desert rain came late, and for a brief moment, the south field bloomed wild with white flowers, a sight no one remembered seeing there before or since. People said it was just weather. Others said it was the harvest, reminding the town that it still breathed, even if only once in a century. By the early 1990s, the legend of the Ward sisters had drifted into that space between folklore and forbidden history, the kind of story you might overhear in a bar, told quietly by someone who wasn't sure they believed it, but wouldn't risk laughing either. In 1992, a geology student from Tucson, Maria Dalton, began a small research project on mineral contamination near historic mining towns. Her field notes, discovered years later among her papers, describe visiting Tombstone and collecting soil samples from various points, including, unintentionally, the southern field. She noted the ground was unusually loose despite decades of drought, and she recorded a steady hum through her portable sensor. "At first I thought it was an error in the calibration," she wrote, "but the reading continued even with the device off. The soil vibrated slightly, as though something beneath it was moving very slowly." Dalton returned to Tucson to analyze her samples. Within 2 weeks, she fell ill with an undiagnosed fever and stopped responding to letters. Her report was never submitted. A decade later, her younger brother donated her remaining field box to the university archives. Inside was a single sealed vial, labeled only with the word Ward. The archivists decided not to open it. That same year, a small paranormal journal published an anonymous article titled "The Gentle Harvest: Case Study of an Unfinished Ritual." The writer claimed to have spent 3 nights near the fenced land and to have seen 2 pale shapes by lantern light. The account ended abruptly. They were not haunting. They were working. The earth itself seemed to exhale as they did. No author's name, no publication address. The magazine folded soon after. By 1997, the fence around the southern field was replaced with a sturdier iron one. A warning sign read, "Private land. Do not enter." No owner was listed. Some said the state had taken control, others that a historical preservation trust had purchased it. The paperwork trails vanish into redactions. That same winter, a park ranger performing maintenance along the southern road reported something peculiar in his log. Ground frost formed only within the fence boundary. Air temp 48 degrees F, soil 27 degrees F. Seemed inverted, cold where it should be warm. No known source. He was later reassigned to Bisbee. As the century closed, the story of the Wards re-emerged on early internet message boards. Users traded scans of old documents and daguerreotypes, each claiming to show the Sisters of Tombstone. Some images were fakes, others harder to dismiss. A few featured the unmistakable crescent and wheat symbol scratched faintly into the background glass. In 1999, an amateur historian named Dr. Scott Irwin announced he had discovered an unopened crate buried near the fairground while metal detecting. He posted a single photograph before deleting his account. The image showed a wooden box lined with wax and glass jars half submerged in the earth. He promised to open it once daylight came. He never posted again. His family later reported him missing during a solo trip near Cochise County. Search parties found his campsite intact, but the soil around it was scorched in a perfect circle, as if by heat from beneath. A year later, a storm washed away part of the southern fence. Town maintenance replaced it quietly. No media coverage, no investigation. And when night fell that week, several residents reported seeing faint lamps flickering across the field. 2, always side by side, moving slowly as if tending something unseen. Some say the sisters were long gone. Others whisper that they were never ghosts to begin with, just caretakers of whatever breath still lingers in the Tombstone soil. The dawn of the new millennium brought more attention to Tombstone than the old town had seen in years. The internet fed curiosities that local silence had protected for generations. True crime podcasts, early forums, and dark history websites rediscovered the story of the Ward sisters and twisted it into a dozen competing myths. Some called them murderers, others herbalists who crossed unseen lines. A few even framed them as victims of hysteria, the last women of science in a superstitious frontier. But amid the noise, real evidence continued to slip quietly through official hands. In 2003, a small museum restoration team cataloging the remaining Cochise County Courthouse archives discovered a fireproof drawer mislabeled "property receipts." Inside were 3 artifacts: a corked vial, a charred notebook fragment, and an envelope containing a faded photograph of two women behind a counter. The inventory tag dated them to 1881. The museum curator, Janet Moore, later told a colleague that when she lifted the photograph into the light, it felt warm, as if it had just been taken. The following week, the vial, still sealed, vanished from its display case. Security footage showed nothing unusual except a faint static distortion lasting 5 seconds at precisely 3:14 a.m. Moore resigned soon after, citing unexplained anxiety. Her resignation letter closed with a single line: "If they ever return, tell them I didn't open it." That same year, during a monsoon that battered the desert, heavy rain exposed several glass fragments along the southern field once again. A local high school teacher, Alan Reeves, collecting samples for a geology club, noticed that some of the shards were etched with lines forming the same crescent and wheat symbol. He turned them in to the sheriff's office. 2 days later, they were listed as lost during transfer. Reeves began to expiate, hence vivid dreams afterward, what he described in his journal as lantern light moving through soil like breath. In his final entry, dated August 3rd, he wrote, "They were never spirits, they were gardeners." When his wife found the notebook, it smelled faintly of violet and rust. By 2008, a few amateur historians had begun to compare the remaining clues, the notebooks, photographs, ledgers, and diaries, with regional maps and property records. Their work suggested something chilling, that each generation's fairgrounds, from Gila to Tucson to Tombstone, had all been built on similar parcels of soil, reclaimed from small fires, bought under aliases linked to names beginning with W. The last of those aliases appeared in a 2010 property deed filed under C.I. Wayne, which listed ownership of 2.7 acres on Tombstone's south end. The signature was neat, curved, and strangely old-fashioned. That same year, tourists began reporting strange phenomena again: flickering lights beyond the fence line, the smell of flowers in winter, and the faint sound of glass clinking under the wind. Local guides turned it into a campfire story, but the town council quietly voted to increase patrols near the property at night. A single report from a deputy survives. Observed two figures at distance, approximately female, wearing dark clothing, moved in unison toward center of field. No entry detected through locked gate. Disappeared when spotlight activated. The incident was logged as unexplained human trespass. And yet, no footprints were found inside. Only 2 impressions pressed faintly into the earth. Not heel marks, not boot treads, but perfect circles, side by side, as though something had been standing just beneath the surface, breathing still. By the 2020s, the story of the Ward sisters had blurred into the greater myth of Tombstone. Whispered online, folded into documentaries, rewritten by voices that never saw the place. But for those who live there still, the legend has never quite settled. The southern fence remains, now rusted and half buried under sand. Tourists walk by without knowing, though some pause mid-sentence, frowning at a smell they can't name. Faint, metallic, and almost sweet. In 2021, a local historian named Dr. Nora Cleaves began compiling a digital archive of all known Ward material. She gathered the journals, the court affidavits, the unverified daguerreotypes. Her final entry, before the project was mysteriously halted, reads, "Everything circles back to the soil. Not the women, the ground itself. It remembers its caretakers." Her external hard drive, retrieved by colleagues, contained only one image file. When opened, it displayed an aerial photograph of the southern field. 2 pale marks could be seen near the center, symmetrical, glowing faintly through the dirt. The metadata listed the file's creation date as October 1881. No further investigation was made. That same autumn, a desert storm struck the outskirts of town. When it cleared, a new fissure appeared where the fence line once stood. Town workers filled it within a week, but photographs taken during the repair show dozens of small glass shards rising from the ground, catching the sun like scales. None remained by nightfall. Old residents say that each year, around harvest season, the air over the south field thickens for a single evening. Coyotes refuse to cross it. Crickets go silent. A few claim to see lantern light gliding slow arcs above the soil, always in pairs. It might be tricks of wind and heat, or the old story working through its rhythm again. The gunfight at the OK Corral is still Tombstone's claim to fame, its violence and noise frozen in legend. But if you stand at the edge of the quiet acres where no map dares draw lines, another history hums beneath your feet, the kind that never needed bullets or crowds. Every town has a story it tells to be remembered, and another it buries to keep the rest alive. In Tombstone, the buried one still stirs. Locals say the ground there never cools completely, no matter the season. That if you press your palm to the earth at dusk, you'll feel a faint warmth, slow, steady, like breath. And if you listen carefully, you might hear glass shifting just below, and a woman's voice whispering from the soil. The harvest isn't over.